Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Mel. It was great to hear from you, and particularly to be talking about cultural mediation within the context of an Australian artist's work. I think that's really important. So thanks for telling us about your practice. As Rachel said, I'm the curator with Kaldor Public Art Projects. I'd like to start by acknowledging the custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders, families, forebears of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and recognise their continued connections to language, culture and country. Kaldor Public Art Projects, for those who aren't familiar, deliver large-scale public artworks, always free to the public, and in most cases with international visiting artists. We're celebrating 50 years since Christo and Jean-Claude wrapped Little Bay with an exhibition that opens at the Art Gallery of New South Wales next week. And I'm going to play a really brief video if it will allow me. So as you can see, we have no single permanent physical space where we constantly present works, and what that means is we rely heavily on the infrastructure around our projects to really mediate and strengthen the audience's experience. We have a history of working with artists who, through their practice, engage a group of people to mediate the audience's experience, and increasingly we're finding that this group is not only facilitating or introducing the group to the audience to the work, but they are in fact part of the work. And I'm going to touch on a few of these instances before diving deeper into our most recent project with Asad Raza. And the first is No Cigars, This Is So Contemporary for Project 29, which presented at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2014. And Tino's been described as an architect of interaction, and he's really challenged the way institutions present contemporary art, but also how audiences engage, particularly spatially, with contemporary art. This work is a constructed situation where a group of people essentially embody or interpret the work for visitors. And Tino doesn't allow any documentation of his works. And so this poses real issues for institutions, particularly with regards to marketing, but also presenting information to visitors on site. And so as the presenters, we were, we had to deal with different parameters around what we could and couldn't say, how we could articulate the work. And we were forced to introduce a group called Living Brochures, who, in lieu of printed didactics or marketing material, could mediate the audience's experience, but also care for the interpreters themselves, because they were essentially the work. For Marina Abramovich Project 30 in 2015, visitors were invited to participate in simple, slow and repetitive exercises which explored physical and psychological limits. And mediating this experience were a group of facilitators who one at a time led visitors by the hand in silence to commence the first and subsequent activities. And this group are really crucial to creating a heightened sense of vulnerability for the visitor. And whilst visitors were often attending in groups, what these facilitators enabled was a chance for them to identify themselves as an individual within the context of the collective. And the third is Jonathan Jones, who presented Project 32, Barangal Jara, at the Botanical Gardens in Sydney. And the project really gave voice to objects, histories and stories that were lost in the burning of the Garden Palace. And it was really enabled by a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous invigilators. Collectively, what these projects have really given us is the ability to build an informed and engaged mediator specific to the needs of that project and the artist. It means we're constantly changing the criteria for candidates we're looking for. So for Tino, it was a group of people who could translate an encounter, but who could also blend into the institution's architecture spatially. For Marina, it was a group of people who were very familiar with performance art or other forms of body practice, but who could maintain focus for a long period of time and who could engage very intimately with visitors. And for Jonathan, It was a group of people who could often had to negotiate very challenging conversations, and we relied on very authentic connections between particularly our Indigenous facilitators to tell stories to visitors about something that was often not understood or not very familiar to our visitors. So on the one hand, there was the sculptural form of Jonathan's work, and on the other, the non-scripted and dialogical element, which was carried by these Indigenous facilitators. And it's in this handing over from Jonathan to these facilitators that there is a parallel in our most recent work with Asad Raza. And the group I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today are his cultivators who inhabited Project 34, Absorption, presented in collaboration with Carriageworks. So on paper and in images, the work consisted of 300 tonnes of soil, collaborations with 9 Australian artists, collaboration with the University of Sydney's Institute of Agriculture, and of course the cultivators themselves. But what Absorption can really be boiled down to was a space for experience and exchange, not too dissimilar to a project Asad had done recently at the Whitney Biennial, a work called Root Sequence Mother Tongue. And I mention this project as it really starts to inform us as to how Asad works with diverse stakeholders to create a space for exchange in his work. So Root Sequence Mother Tongue saw 26 trees brought into the museum, and a group of caretakers cared for each tree. They placed an individual object with each tree, and when visitors arrived, these caretakers would talk to people about the trees and the objects. It was essentially a work about different relationships with people and non-living objects. And it's this work and Absorption that really start to explore and enact Asad's discursive and curatorial practice, where he looks at questions such as how best do we collaborate, who is the author of what, how do we find a relevant version of the stage or exhibition site for the 21st century, and how do we use and place bodies in those settings for use beyond display or mere interaction. And these works, really enabled by their cultivators and their caretakers, make some effort in addressing this last question. They invite us to come into relation and get something out of the exchange. So Asad's work often references Edouard Glissant, who says that relation is chaos opera, that when you begin to relate to something, you enter into communication, into a transaction, and you don't always know what's going to happen. And there's always an element of this in Asad's work, and I think it's incredibly risky, but it has the potential to glean something much more interesting for the viewer. So unlike mediators we'd engaged in the past, where there were firm parameters for how they could speak or behave in the space, the cultivators could, depending on the visitor, decide whether they were talking about absorption more broadly. They could invite a visitor to participate in a task. They could take soil home for their own projects. And Asad really liked the ambiguity or the lack of hierarchy in messaging in this work. And cultivators were there to engage with visitors as much as they were to care for the soil, ultimately for it to be given away at the end of the project. So in this sense, there was a real equalising between the relationship of the cultivators with the visitors, with the material and with the artist. So who were our cultivators and how did we assemble them? We knew we needed a group who could take on the complexity of the work and relate to it in a number of ways, and we hoped that by finding this diverse group, they could begin to explore ideas such as care, routine, repetition, growth and decay, and the fluidity between life and death. Our learnings from other projects had taught us that we couldn't do a public call-out, but a much more targeted approach was required. So we targeted conversations across disciplines, and these filtered into areas including biology, local artists, neighbours who worked in areas from community gardening, construction. And in this sense, we really resisted the urge in institutions to search for mediators with backgrounds specifically in art history or pedagogy or cultural studies. And we really focused on ways of accessing people with more tangential connections to the project. A big part of Asad's practice is how he relates to people and how quickly he can build a community around an idea or a project. And so particular care was taken in the management of this group with one central point of contact. And it sounds like a minor detail, and it's actually really important in fostering a really strong relationship between our team and the cultivators. So we really took the time to know each and every one of them, and it also encouraged a willingness for these cultivators to be in dialogue with each other, which was really important for the success of the work. So given the cultivators once found and selected were made up of the likes of soil chemists, community gardeners, performers, the workshopping and the creative development of the work was less an opportunity to hear about one artist's vision, but more an opportunity to hear from each other. So in the 2 weeks preceding the project, the group developed and refined the activities for working the soil. They collectively decided what kind of material and what kind of data they wanted to collect from the project. And it was also an opportunity for them to meet and hear from the artist collaborators, and they met with all of them, which was really important for discussing the collaborative processes and sharing it with the audience. And Asad really created space for multiple artists to present work. And I guess the main reason for doing this was creating a palette of ideas for the cultivator to explore with the audience. So in this image, Daniel Boyd's work frames the space and created a beautiful filtered light in the entire installation with an effect he called a cultural lens, or a way to approach differing points of view. And this was the first artist collaborator Asad invited to participate in the work, and it set a strong tone for the whole nature of the space. Also in the image, a cultivator is wearing one of the works, which was created by Agatha Gertz-Snape. Discrete Relations is the title of the work, using the 2 spellings of the word discrete. And this was, Agatha's work generally springs from a cultural and political context which it's created, and these pieces were lined with fabrics from John Kaldor Fabric Maker, and really provided a kind of psychological and a physical protective outer layer for our cultivators. And 2 new works were made in dialogue with the University of Sydney Institute of Agriculture, with the purpose of really inviting or creating works which would invite dialogue between the audience and cultivators. And the first was Megan Alice Clune's experimental soil piece, Soil Music, which measured the moisture levels within the soil. So this was a work that was particularly powerful in engaging a more tentative viewer, as it created a more intimate experience of the project's material. And the other work is Jana Hawkins Anderson's Swell, which, working with the Institute, she introduced a slow-release fertiliser into her clay-making process. And she created handmade moulds, which created these leach forms. And just as Asad imbued cultivators with as much of the power to really explore the ideas within absorption, Jana's work was another handing over to the cultivators. And it was a particular favourite of mine, as Jana had never previously shown works which were unfired or works which were handled and ultimately finished by others. And in this sense, she really invited the visitor into dialogue with the cultivator. They could help make the moulds, they could help make the objects, and then they could also take a ready-made object and return it back to the soil. So with every detail considered in the approach, the staging and arrival, our education program had to be approached and adapt to the environment as well. And in this sense, it was a decision collectively that rather than our educators who normally lead our programs, the cultivators had to lead these programs to really give a consistency of voice in the space. And this was a first for us, and our educators had to take a back seat, but what they were able to do was work really well with a new group of people, with these cultivators, to also give them skills in dealing with working with students of different levels, different ages, and working together to convey the different ideas within the work. So this is an image of a digital resource which was being made at the time with one of our Indigenous collaborator, Dean Cross. Asad often spoke about creating an environment where audiences, cultivators, and the physical environment were all equal contributors to the work. So the daily running of the project encouraged this constant feedback with morning and evening debriefs between the cultivators, the artist, and our producers. And it really allowed us to keep track of the processes occurring within the project, but also hear from audience and visitor feedback and share any news or new ideas that audiences were suggesting, which was happening all the time. And so by allowing a constant transfer of knowledge in multiple directions, that knowledge had the power to really affect and change the work in that instant and not in retrospect. So in closing and thinking about cultural mediation as a tool for communication, what we've seen as an organisation is mediators moving from communicating an organisation's message to communicating an artist's message, and in the case of absorption, cultivators really communicating their own message and really inviting audiences into dialogue. So returning to Glissant's idea of chaos opera, the space was able to function as a living and breathing space for exchange. That's all. Thanks, Rich.